Imagine waking up in one of Africa's poorest landlocked nations, then discovering an 8-lane expressway racing across the horizon. Burkina Faso, long associated with conflict, insecurity, and hardship, is suddenly appearing in headlines for something entirely different: ambition. Supporters call it a symbol of national rebirth. Critics question whether the promises can match reality. So what is really happening inside Burkina Faso? Is this the beginning of an extraordinary transformation, or are we witnessing a story that has grown larger than the facts themselves? Today, we'll follow the roads, the people, the decisions, and the unanswered questions behind one of the world's most debated leaders, separating verified developments from viral claims, and asking whether this remarkable journey is changing a nation, changing Africa, or changing how the world chooses to see both. In just a few short years, Burkina Faso has gone from rarely making international headlines to becoming one of the most talked-about countries in Africa. New highway projects, expanding infrastructure, and a growing message of self-reliance have drawn global attention, while videos praising President Ibrahim Traoré continue spreading rapidly across social media. Yet behind every inspiring image lies a more complex story, one shaped by years of insecurity, political upheaval, and the daily struggles of ordinary families. To understand why so many people have placed their hopes in this young military leader, we first have to step back to a time before the speeches, before the headlines, and before the world even knew his name. Long before the world debated Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso was already fighting a battle that rarely appeared on international television. For years, families watched entire communities change almost overnight. Roads that once connected villages became dangerous to travel. Farmers worried less about the next harvest than whether they could safely return home before sunset. Teachers abandoned classrooms, businesses struggled to survive, and thousands of ordinary people were forced to leave behind the places they had called home for generations. To outsiders, Burkina Faso seemed to fade quietly into the background of global affairs. It was often mentioned only when another security crisis erupted or another humanitarian report was published. Yet behind those headlines lived millions of people who still woke up every morning hoping that tomorrow might be different. That hope slowly became more difficult to hold on to. Government after government promised greater security, stronger institutions, and economic progress. But for many citizens, daily life seemed to grow more uncertain instead of more stable. As insecurity spread across parts of the country, confidence in traditional political leadership began to weaken. Conversations in markets, homes, and military barracks increasingly centered on the same question: how much longer could the country continue on this path? That question did not belong to politicians alone. It belonged to farmers trying to protect their fields. It belonged to truck drivers navigating dangerous highways. It belonged to parents wondering whether their children would grow up in peace. And it belonged to young soldiers sent to defend communities under conditions that often seemed impossible. This was no longer simply a political crisis. It was becoming a crisis of confidence. Across Burkina Faso, many people were no longer searching for perfect leaders. They were searching for someone who could restore a sense of direction, someone willing to make difficult decisions, whether popular or not. It was within this atmosphere of uncertainty, frustration, and cautious hope that a relatively unknown military officer began attracting attention inside the armed forces. At the time, few people outside Burkina Faso had ever heard his name. Fewer still could have imagined that, within a remarkably short period, he would become one of the most recognizable and controversial faces on the African continent. But before that happened, one moment would change both his life and the future of an entire nation. In 2022, that turning point arrived. Amid growing frustration within both the military and the wider public, Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged as the leader of a military takeover that promised a different direction for Burkina Faso. At just 34 years old, he quickly became one of the world's youngest heads of state. For supporters, his youth represented energy, determination, and the courage to challenge ideas that many believed had failed for decades. For critics, however, replacing one military government with another raised difficult questions about democracy, accountability, and the country's long-term future. Almost immediately, Traoré began delivering a message that was remarkably simple. Burkina Faso, he argued, could no longer depend on others to solve its problems. Whether discussing security, economic development, or national resources, his speeches repeatedly returned to the same central theme: self-reliance. It was a message that resonated with many citizens who had grown tired of years of instability and broken promises. But speeches alone could never rebuild public confidence. People wanted to see results. They wanted safer roads, functioning schools, thriving farms, jobs for young people, and visible signs that their country was moving forward rather than standing still. As new infrastructure projects, road construction, and public investment began attracting attention, images from Burkina Faso started spreading far beyond Africa. Videos showing freshly paved highways, construction equipment, and ambitious development plans accumulated millions of views online. To many viewers, these images appeared to tell the story of a nation transforming at remarkable speed. Yet images rarely tell the whole story. Supporters pointed to them as evidence that Burkina Faso had finally found decisive leadership. Critics argued that a country's progress could not be measured by viral videos alone, and urged observers to examine broader economic, humanitarian, and security indicators as well. The debate was no longer confined to Burkina Faso. It had become international. Across Africa, Europe, and the United States, people began asking the same question. Was this the beginning of an extraordinary national transformation, or was the internet witnessing only one chapter of a much more complicated story? To answer that question, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine the projects that transformed Ibrahim Traoré into a global symbol, and why one particular network of roads became the center of that conversation. For years, much of the world's attention toward Burkina Faso had centered on conflict, displacement, and instability. Then, something unusual happened. The images began to change. Instead of burned villages and emergency aid convoys, social media feeds started filling with videos of heavy machinery carving new highways across open landscapes. Freshly paved roads stretched toward growing communities. Construction crews worked beneath the intense West African sun. Drone footage captured long ribbons of asphalt cutting through terrain that only a few years earlier had rarely appeared in international conversations. To many viewers around the world, the contrast was striking. The country they thought they knew suddenly looked different. Supporters of President Ibrahim Traoré shared these images as proof that Burkina Faso was entering a new chapter, one focused on rebuilding rather than simply surviving. Across platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and X, short videos highlighting infrastructure projects reached millions of people, often accompanied by bold claims that the country was experiencing an economic revolution. But viral images tell only part of the story. Road construction is among the most visible forms of development because progress can literally be seen from the ground and from the sky. Unlike policy reforms or economic indicators, a completed highway requires no explanation. Anyone can look at it and immediately recognize that something tangible has been built. That visibility gave these projects extraordinary symbolic power. For many citizens, better roads represented more than transportation. They represented access to hospitals, access to schools, access to markets where farmers could sell their crops before they spoiled. For business owners, improved transport promised lower costs and faster deliveries. For truck drivers, safer and more reliable routes meant fewer delays. For families living far from major cities, every kilometer of new pavement carried the possibility of greater opportunity. In other words, these roads were never just about concrete and asphalt. They became symbols of hope. Yet symbols often carry expectations that are far larger than the projects themselves. As admiration for the new infrastructure spread online, another question quietly emerged among economists, analysts, and international observers. Could roads alone transform a nation facing deep security and economic challenges? Or were they only the first visible step in a much longer journey? Those questions would soon become just as important as the roads themselves. The more experts examined Burkina Faso's infrastructure projects, the clearer one point became. These roads were never intended to exist in isolation. Throughout history, transportation has often served as the backbone of economic development. A road does far more than connect two places on a map. It connects farmers to markets, manufacturers to customers, students to schools, and patients to hospitals. In countries seeking long-term growth, transportation networks can influence almost every sector of daily life. That broader perspective helps explain why infrastructure became such a visible priority. For supporters of Ibrahim Traoré's government, investment in roads reflected a belief that national development begins with strengthening the country's foundations. Better transportation could encourage domestic trade, improve access to remote communities, and make future investment more attractive. At the same time, economists have long pointed out that infrastructure alone cannot guarantee prosperity. Roads require maintenance. Businesses need investment. Farmers need stable markets. Schools need teachers. Hospitals need equipment. And above all, lasting economic progress depends on security, effective institutions, and conditions that allow communities to thrive over many years. In other words, roads can open doors, but people must still be able to walk through them. That distinction is often lost in short online videos. A 30-second clip can show a newly paved highway. It cannot easily show whether local businesses are expanding, whether household incomes are rising, or whether families feel safer than they did before. Those answers take time. They require evidence that unfolds over years rather than weeks. Perhaps that is why opinions about Burkina Faso remain so divided. Some observers see the country's infrastructure projects as encouraging signs of determination and ambition. Others argue that the ultimate measure of success will not be the number of kilometers completed, but whether those projects improve the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. Both perspectives point toward the same truth. Infrastructure is not the finish line. It is the beginning of a much longer journey. And as the roads continued stretching across Burkina Faso, another transformation was taking place, one that reached far beyond construction sites. The country's changing image was beginning to reshape how millions of people around the world viewed both Ibrahim Traoré and Africa itself. That change in perception would soon become almost as influential as the roads themselves. Something unexpected happened as the new roads stretched across Burkina Faso. The construction projects did more than reshape the landscape. They reshaped the conversation. For years, Burkina Faso had received only brief moments of international attention, usually during reports of conflict or humanitarian emergencies. Now, for the first time in decades, millions of people were sharing the country's name for an entirely different reason. Videos of highways, construction sites, industrial equipment, and public speeches began appearing across YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and X, attracting audiences far beyond West Africa. The algorithms seemed to reward every new image. One video became 10. 10 became hundreds. Soon, millions of viewers who had never heard of Burkina Faso were suddenly debating its future. For many, Ibrahim Traoré quickly became more than a political leader. He became a symbol. To supporters around the world, he represented confidence, national pride, and the belief that African countries could pursue their own path without waiting for solutions from abroad. Motivational videos paired his speeches with dramatic music, sweeping drone footage, and bold captions proclaiming that a new chapter had begun. Yet just as quickly, another conversation emerged. Journalists, researchers, and regional analysts urged people to look beyond the viral clips. They pointed out that a nation's future cannot be measured through carefully selected moments alone. While roads and construction projects are visible signs of investment, they exist alongside other realities that are far less dramatic on camera. Security, public services, economic resilience, and the daily lives of millions of citizens. Two very different stories were now traveling across the same internet. One celebrated visible progress. The other called for careful patience. Neither story disappeared. Instead, they continued growing side by side. And perhaps that was the most remarkable transformation of all. Burkina Faso had become one of the few countries where a single highway could spark a global debate about leadership, development, and Africa's future. But the deeper the discussion became, the more difficult one question proved to answer. Were people witnessing a genuine national transformation, or were they watching the extraordinary power of perception in the digital age? History has a way of humbling first impressions. Again and again, nations have been celebrated too early, or underestimated for far too long. The headlines that capture the world's attention often describe only a single moment, while history measures something far more demanding: what endures. Burkina Faso now finds itself at precisely that point. The roads are real. The construction is real. The renewed sense of national confidence expressed by many supporters is real as well. But so are the difficult questions that continue to shape the country's future. Can economic opportunities expand quickly enough to reach ordinary families? Can improvements in infrastructure be matched by lasting gains in education, healthcare, and local businesses? Can security continue improving in communities that have experienced years of instability? These are questions that no viral video can answer. Only time can. Perhaps that is why Burkina Faso has become one of the most closely watched countries in Africa. Not because everyone agrees about its future, but because so many people disagree. For some observers, Ibrahim Traoré represents a generation determined to rewrite old assumptions about African leadership and national development. For others, the true measure of success will depend not on powerful speeches or impressive construction projects, but on whether lasting improvements can be seen in the everyday lives of millions of citizens over the years ahead. In reality, both perspectives remind us of something important. Real transformation is rarely dramatic when viewed up close. It happens one decision, one community, one school, one business, and sometimes one road at a time. That may be the most valuable lesson hidden beneath all the online debate. The highways captured the world's attention, but the future of Burkina Faso will ultimately be written not by drone footage or social media algorithms. It will be written by the people who wake up every morning, travel those roads, build new businesses, teach in classrooms, harvest their fields, and raise the next generation. Only they can determine whether today's optimism becomes tomorrow's history. And that brings us to the final question. After all the headlines, the debates, and the powerful images, what does Burkina Faso's story truly teach us about leadership, resilience, and the future of a nation? By now, you may have noticed something surprising. This story was never really about a highway, and perhaps it was never only about Ibrahim Traoré either. Leaders come and go, governments change, policies rise, evolve, and sometimes disappear altogether. But the questions that shape a nation's future remain remarkably consistent across generations. Can a country rebuild trust after years of uncertainty? Can people recover confidence once it has been lost? Can visible progress create the momentum needed for deeper, lasting change? These questions reach far beyond Burkina Faso. History offers many examples of nations that invested heavily in rebuilding after periods of crisis. Some succeeded in creating stronger institutions and expanding opportunity over time. Others discovered that physical infrastructure, while important, was only one part of a much larger challenge. Roads can connect cities. They cannot, by themselves, create prosperity. Buildings can transform skylines. They cannot, by themselves, guarantee confidence in the future. Ultimately, it is people, not concrete, not speeches, and not headlines, who determine whether change becomes permanent. That may be the most important lesson hidden within Burkina Faso's story. The roads captured the world's attention, but they also challenged millions of people to reconsider something they had quietly assumed for years. What if the greatest transformation was not taking place on the ground, but inside the minds of those watching from thousands of miles away? Perhaps that is why stories like Burkina Faso's capture our imagination. Not because they provide easy answers, but because they remind us how difficult real change has always been. Every generation witnesses leaders who inspire hope. Every generation also learns that hope alone is never enough. History asks harder questions. Did people's lives become safer? Did children inherit greater opportunity? Did communities grow stronger than they were before? Those are the measures that endure long after speeches have faded and headlines have disappeared. Today, no one can honestly claim to know how Burkina Faso's story will ultimately be remembered. The country continues to face serious challenges. It also continues to pursue ambitions that have captured attention far beyond its borders. Both realities exist at the same time, and perhaps accepting that complexity is the first step toward understanding it. Years from now, historians will have access to evidence we do not yet possess. They will examine decisions whose consequences are still unfolding. They will judge successes alongside failures, achievements alongside missed opportunities. But unlike history, we do not have the luxury of looking backward. We are watching this story while it is still being written. That may be the most remarkable part of all. The roads are still carrying workers to construction sites. Children are still walking into classrooms. Farmers are still taking their harvests to market. Families are still hoping that tomorrow will be more secure than yesterday. Life continues. History has not reached its final chapter. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson Burkina Faso offers the world. Not that one leader can transform a nation overnight, but that the future of every nation is written day by millions of ordinary people whose names may never appear in history books. When that future is finally judged, the verdict will belong not to social media, not to politicians, not even to today's headlines. It will belong to history itself. So, where does Burkina Faso go from here? The truth is, no one on earth can answer that question with certainty. history is still being written. The roads are still carrying workers to their jobs. Children are still walking into classrooms. Farmers are still planting seeds they hope to harvest months from now. Every new sunrise adds another page to a story that remains unfinished. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson this journey has to offer. Real leadership is never measured only by speeches. Real progress is never measured only by buildings. And real hope is never measured only by today's headlines. It is measured by the lives that are changed, one family, one community, and one generation at a time. The Bible reminds us in Matthew 7:16, "By their fruits you will recognize them, not by promises, not by appearances, but by the lasting results they leave behind." Maybe that wisdom applies not only to leaders, but to nations, and perhaps it even applies to us. Because every one of us must decide whether we will judge the world through headlines or through patience, truth, and understanding. One day, historians will write the final chapter of Burkina Faso's story. But today, that chapter is still blank. If this documentary challenged the way you think, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what do you believe history will ultimately remember about this moment in Burkina Faso? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective may help someone else see this story from an entirely different point of view. And if you enjoy thoughtful documentaries that go beyond the headlines to explore history, leadership, and the lessons we can all learn from them, consider subscribing and joining us on the next journey. Because somewhere in the world, another story is unfolding right now. And together, we'll be there to witness it before history writes its final verdict.